For years, I had tolerated my HOA's endless rules, fines, and overreach. I paid my dues, attended meetings, and tried to stay under the radar. But when I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door last Tuesday morning, I knew things had gone too far. Immediate fine, $500 monthly increase, violation, excessive vehicles on property. I stared at the paper in disbelief. 3 cars, my work truck, my wife's SUV, and the used Honda we had just bought for our daughter's 16th birthday. That was all it took for Karen Mitchell, our power-hungry HOA president, to slap me with a ridiculous fine. From my kitchen window, I watched as Karen strutted down the sidewalk, pink clipboard in hand, snapping photos of my driveway. This wasn't the first time. She had been doing it all week, waiting for the perfect excuse to target my family. What she didn't know? I had spent the last 5 years quietly buying up homes in this neighborhood through my real estate company. And as of this morning, I officially owned 67% of the properties. Tonight, at the emergency HOA meeting, Karen would find out exactly who she had been messing with. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie. Tonight wasn't just another HOA meeting. It was the night everything changed. I grabbed my folder of documents and headed out the door. The community center was packed when I arrived. Karen stood at the front, a smug smile on her face as she clicked through a PowerPoint presentation. On the screen were photos of my driveway, zoomed in to make my 3 cars look like a full-blown parking lot. "As you can see," Karen said, tapping her sparkly pink gavel, "this kind of behavior lowers property values. We need to maintain the integrity of our community, which is why we are proposing a new bylaw limiting each household to 2 vehicles, garage parking only." I glanced around the room. Some neighbors looked concerned, others frustrated. Mrs. Rodriguez, my elderly neighbor, rolled her eyes. Mr. Chen, the high school science teacher, scribbled furious notes. They had all been victims of Karen's selective enforcement before. That was my cue. I stood up slowly. "Point of order, Madam President," I said. Karen barely glanced up. "You're not recognized, Mr. Thompson." I smiled. "Actually, according to HOA Bylaw Section 73, any property owner may raise a point of order regarding voting procedures." The room fell silent. Karen's expression flickered, but she quickly regained her composure. "Fine," she said. "Make it quick." I walked to the front of the room, placing my folder on the table. Before we vote on these new regulations, I think it's important for everyone to understand who actually owns this neighborhood. Karen's smile faltered. "For the past 5 years," I continued, "a company called Sunrise Properties has been purchasing homes in this development. Every time a house went up for sale, we acquired it through different LLCs to keep the transactions discreet." I pulled out a large map of the neighborhood and unrolled it on the table. Every property I owned was highlighted in red. "And as of this morning," I said, "Sunrise Properties officially owns 67% of the homes in this community." Karen's face turned pale. I looked her straight in the eye. "And as CEO of Sunrise Properties, that makes me the majority owner of this HOA." A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Karen's hands trembled as she gripped the podium. That's not possible," she stammered. "Oh, it's very possible," I said, pulling out a thick stack of documents. "And before we continue with this meeting, I'd like to discuss some rather interesting financial discrepancies I've uncovered." Karen's husband Bob whispered something in her ear. Her eyes widened. She had just realized that for the first time in years, She wasn't the one in control. And we were just getting started. Karen's face drained of color as she clutched her pink clipboard like a lifeline. The room had gone completely silent, every eye locked on her. Even her usual supporters, the ones whose Christmas decorations stayed up until March without fines, looked uneasy. I flipped open my folder and held up a stack of printed emails. For the past 5 years, I've documented every selective fine, every rule change that mysteriously benefited your friends, and every time you ignored real issues to enforce petty ones. Karen forced a laugh. This is ridiculous. The board has full authority to enforce community standards. That's interesting, I said, clicking a remote in my hand. The projector screen switched from Karen's PowerPoint to security footage. Because here you are, at 3 a.m. on Tuesday, measuring my grass with a ruler. Gasps filled the room. Karen's mouth fell open. I clicked again. A new image appeared. Karen taking photos of my teenage daughter's car in our driveway late at night. And here you are, trespassing on my property to document a vehicle that was legally parked? Tell me, Karen, how does this protect property values? She took a step back, but I wasn't finished. Let's talk about money, I said, placing another document on the table. Last summer, you charged every homeowner a $200 pool renovation fee. That's over $50,000 in collected funds. I held up a report. But according to bank records, that money was transferred to a personal account. Karen's hands shook as she grabbed her water bottle. That's a private matter. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Mrs. Johnson, our elderly neighbor, stood up, her voice trembling. I was fined $200 last winter for not shoveling my walkway fast enough. I was in the hospital with pneumonia. Others started shouting their own stories. Mr. Chen stood up. You fined me for parking over the line during a snowstorm. Karen banged her gavel, her voice shrill. This meeting is out of order. I shook my head. No, Karen. What's out of order is an HOA president who uses her position to intimidate, manipulate, and steal from homeowners. She turned to Bob, but he looked just as panicked. That's when I pulled out the final document. As the majority owner of this HOA, I move to dissolve the current board, I said, my voice steady. And I call for a vote to elect a new leadership, one that actually serves this community instead of exploiting it. A stunned silence filled the room. Then, one by one, hands started going up. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Chen, Mrs. Johnson. Soon, almost every person in the room had raised their hand. Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, she screeched, grabbing her purse and storming toward the exit. I simply smiled. Actually, Karen, I think you'll be hearing from ours. And just like that, her reign was over. Karen stormed toward the exit, her heels clicking against the tile floor. But before she could reach the door, a voice called out. Wait just a minute, Karen. It was Bob Chen, the science teacher, standing up from his seat. He held a stack of papers in his hands, shaking his head in disbelief. I just looked through these financial reports James provided. These numbers don't add up. Where did all the money from our HOA dues really go? The room fell silent again. Karen froze, her back still turned to us. I crossed my arms, giving her a chance to respond. You said the pool needed repairs, but it's been broken for over a year. You said we needed new streetlights, yet half of them are still out. And you charged people insane fees for minor violations while letting your friends slide. Karen whirled around, her face flushed. This is nonsense. You people don't understand how hard it is to run a community. A few of her usual supporters nodded, but the majority of the room had clearly lost faith in her. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up next. "No, Karen, we understand just fine. We just never had the power to do anything about it until now." Karen's eyes darted around the room, looking for allies, but the tide had turned. The people who had once been too afraid to speak were finally standing up. Mr. Chen turned to me. "James, if you own the majority of this neighborhood, what are you planning to do? Are we just trading one dictator for another?" I smiled. "Absolutely not." I pulled out another folder and spread it on the table. "Here's my proposal. A new HOA board made up of actual homeowners, not just a select group of people playing favorites. Term limits to prevent power abuse, and every dollar collected from fees will go toward real improvements, not Karen's personal vacation fund." A few skeptical voices murmured in the crowd. "And what about all these ridiculous fines?" someone asked. I nodded. "We review every single one. If a rule doesn't make sense or only exists to punish people unfairly, we remove it." Karen scoffed. "You're going to destroy property values." I chuckled. "Actually, I spoke to a real estate agent last week. Do you know what drives down home prices? An HOA that makes life miserable for its residents." I turned to the crowd. "What do you think? Would you rather live in a place where you're treated like a criminal for parking in your own driveway, or a place where neighbors actually help each other?" A few people clapped, then more. And soon, the whole room was filled with cheers. Karen's face twisted with rage. She snatched her gavel from the podium, her hands shaking. "This meeting is over." I shook my head, smiling. "No, Karen, this is just the beginning." Karen clenched her jaw, gripping her pink gavel so tightly her knuckles turned white. But no one was listening to her anymore. The power she had wielded for years, through fear, fines, and favoritism, was slipping away, and she knew it. I turned to the crowd. "We have a choice. We can either let this HOA continue to serve the interests of a few, or we can rebuild it to serve everyone fairly." Mrs. Johnson, the 82-year-old who had been fined for her too vibrant rose bushes, slowly raised her hand. "I vote to dissolve this board and elect a new one." "I second that," Mr. Chen said firmly. Hands shot up all over the room. Karen's husband, Bob, shuffled uncomfortably in his seat. He had been the one passing out Karen's new proposed bylaws, but now he looked like he wanted to disappear. "You can't just take over like this," he sputtered. I pulled out my final document, the one my lawyer had been holding on to for this exact moment. "Actually, we can. As the majority property owner, I have the right to challenge the leadership of the HOA and call for a re-election. And with over 2/3 of the neighborhood voting against you, Karen, it looks like your time is up." Karen let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Fine. You want to run things? Go ahead. But you'll regret it. People like me keep neighborhoods in order. Without rules, this place will turn into chaos." I met her gaze steadily. "There's a difference between order and control. We're not getting rid of the rules. We're making them fair. And more importantly, we're making sure the people in charge actually care about this community, not just their own interests." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, the back doors of the meeting hall swung open. A news crew stepped inside, cameras rolling. "Karen Mitchell?" one of the reporters asked, stepping forward. "We've received multiple complaints from residents about HOA misconduct. Would you care to comment on these allegations of financial mismanagement and selective enforcement?" The color drained from Karen's face. She turned on her heel and stormed out, pushing past the reporters as they fired off more questions. Bob hurried after her, his head down. A heavy silence hung in the room for a moment before Mrs. Rodriguez spoke up. "So, what now?" I smiled. "Now we rebuild. A fair HOA, real transparency, and rules that actually serve this community." The room erupted into applause. As I looked around, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Hope. People weren't just fed up anymore. They were ready to take back their neighborhood. And for the first time, this place finally felt like home. The next morning, I sat at my desk, staring at the dozens of emails flooding my inbox. Neighbors were reaching out, some to thank me, some with ideas for the new HOA, and a few former supporters of Karen, now suddenly eager to make amends. I leaned back in my chair, taking it all in. 5 years of quiet planning, of watching Karen abuse her power, of waiting for the right moment. It had all led to this. A knock on my door pulled me from my thoughts. I opened it to find Mrs. Johnson, the elderly widow who had been fined for her rose bushes, standing on my porch with a tin of cookies. "Just a little something to say thank you," she said, smiling warmly. I invited her in, and we talked over coffee. She told me how she had considered selling her home because of Karen's relentless fines and harassment. "But now," she said, "I finally feel like I belong here again." Her words stuck with me. This wasn't just about getting rid of Karen. It was about making sure no one else would ever feel like a prisoner in their own neighborhood again. Later that afternoon, I walked through the community, something I hadn't done in years without worrying about a clipboard-wielding HOA enforcer lurking around the corner. Parents were outside playing with their kids. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before were chatting by their mailboxes. The air felt lighter. As I reached the community center, I saw a group of volunteers repainting the playground fence, a project Karen had repeatedly denied funding for. I grabbed a brush and started helping. "Didn't think we'd see you doing manual labor, Mr. CEO," Mr. Chen teased, handing me a can of paint. I laughed. "Just because I own the most houses doesn't mean I'm above a little hard work." Over the next few weeks, the new HOA board took shape. We put a cap on fines, eliminated ridiculous rules, and created a system where homeowners could actually appeal violations instead of being forced to pay blindly. More importantly, we started using HOA funds for what they were meant for: fixing sidewalks, repairing the pool, and supporting elderly residents who needed help maintaining their homes. One evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something different. For the first time in years, Karen's car wasn't parked in front of her house. A moving truck sat in her driveway instead. She was leaving. I stood there for a moment, watching as she loaded the last of her things into her car. For all the trouble she had caused, I didn't feel anger or satisfaction, just relief. As I stepped inside, my daughter called out, "Hey, Dad, what should we call the new HOA?" I smiled, glancing at the sign we had all voted to put up near the entrance of the neighborhood. "How about Thompson Hills? A place where good neighbors make great communities. Banjun Noi." A few weeks after Karen left, life in the neighborhood felt completely different. The air was lighter, the tension was gone, and for the first time in years, people weren't afraid to step outside without worrying about a violation notice appearing on their doorstep. One evening, I took a slow walk through the community, taking in the small but meaningful changes. The community pool, once left in disrepair while Karen pocketed the renovation funds, was finally getting fixed. Families gathered at the park, chatting and laughing instead of whispering about the latest HOA fine. The elderly residents, once targeted for trivial violations, now had volunteers helping with yard work instead of being threatened with penalties. And my driveway? My work truck, my wife's SUV, and my daughter's car sat there proudly, untouched. No more warning notices, no more ridiculous fines, just a family living in peace. I hadn't set out to take over the HOA. I just wanted to protect my home. But in the process, I had helped transform an entire community. It wasn't about power. It was about fairness, about standing up when something wasn't right, and making sure no one else had to go through what we had endured. One afternoon, a black sedan pulled up outside my house. A man in a suit stepped out and rang my doorbell. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked, extending a business card. "I'm with a production company. We saw the news coverage about what you did here, and we think your story could make for an incredible documentary." I chuckled, shaking my head. "You want to make a movie about an HOA fight?" He smiled. "It's more than that. It's about standing up to abuse of power, about a neighborhood taking back control. People love stories like that." I thought about it for a moment, about the years of frustration, the careful planning, the final confrontation where Karen's empire had crumbled in front of her. And now, here we were, a thriving community, free from the tyranny of a corrupt HOA. "All right," I said finally, "let's do it." A few days later, as I stood outside watching kids ride their bikes down the street, I noticed a small white envelope taped to my mailbox. For a split second, my heart clenched, a leftover reflex from years of dealing with Karen's notices. But as I peeled it off and opened it, I found something unexpected. It was a handwritten note from one of Karen's old supporters. "I was wrong about you. Thank you for making this place better." I smiled, tucking the note into my pocket. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's proving that things can be better, that people deserve to be treated with fairness and respect. And as I looked out at my neighborhood, the neighborhood we had fought for, I knew we had done exactly that. For years, my neighborhood lived under the rule of a power-hungry HOA president who cared more about control than community. But when she crossed the line, I stood up, not with anger, but with strategy, patience, and the law on my side. The biggest lesson? Power only lasts as long as people allow it. Karen's control crumbled the moment we stopped fearing her and started fighting back. Change doesn't come from complaints. It comes from action. Instead of reacting with frustration, I gathered evidence, built a plan, and turned the system against her. In the end, fairness prevailed, and our community became stronger than ever. This lesson applies everywhere, not just in HOA battles. Corrupt bosses, unfair policies, manipulative leaders, they all rely on fear and silence. But when people educate themselves, organize, and push back with logic and facts, they take back control. If you ever find yourself facing injustice, remember, the best way to win isn't through rage, it's through strategy. Stand up, be smart, and take action. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's creating something better. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more insane HOA battles, Karen meltdowns, and tales of justice served, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Have you ever dealt with a nightmare HOA or an unfair rule? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled it. And remember, the best way to fight back is to stay informed, stay smart, and never let a Karen control your life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.